Hello, my name is Quyum and I'm a software engineer intern here at Femion. In this video, I'm going to be doing a solution walkthrough of the 2024 Summer of Spain Challenge 4. So just to recap, I'll be going over the specifications of the question and then I'll be going over the solution and showing you how to create the solution for the problem. So for the um, problem is it's summertime and your local football league is on break. And for players, it's a time for them to rewind after the long season of intense games. But then your local team is worried that by the time the next season would resume, the players might become like unfit. So because of that, the team has decided to build an application to help each player keep track of their calorie intake. That way, when the season resume, the coach would be able to know what routine to give to like each player. They'll be able to like create a personalized training routine for each player based on their calorie intake. Now, the task is for you to create two endpoints. So the first endpoint is this registration endpoint, and that should allow the head coach to add players um, to the application. And we should also have this record endpoint that should allow players to update their calorie intake record. So that's the specification of the question. And as you can see here, we have the what the response should look like for each of the requests. So when a player is registered, we should get a 201 response with the player name and player number um, as part of the response. And when the player updates their calorie intake record, we should also return the player name and their total calories intake. So yeah, that's the specification. So for this particular problem, we'll be using the spin key value store. And what that would allow us to do is to be able to store the record of each player. There's a nice article here that you can check out, just to learn more about the key value store that Spin provides. But for now, I'll just jump into the solution, which I already created, and just walk you through that. So this is the solution. So what I did initially was to create a spin app. You can do that by saying spin new, and then you can pick any of the templates that we have. So for this particular solution, I used the HTTP Go templates. And once that is in, you get like the basic boilerplates without the models. This I added myself. But then you get like the main Go and like everything that we have here. So let me just walk you through the solution. So what I did was to create a new router. So in Spin, we have this spin http.new router method, and this allows you to create a new router basically. So what I did was to specify that I have like two endpoints. That's like the register and record endpoints. And for the register endpoints, I have this method called handle register, which would handle like when a request is made to slash register, this is the method that would get called to handle the registration. And same thing for record. We have the method right here, handle record. So for the registration, the first thing we do is we pass the body of the request. So if you check the specifications here, it says we'll be getting like the player name and the player number as part of the request. So what I did here was to create a model called register request, and this model contains two fields, which is the player name and player number. And I've also provided the JSON field to be like the player underscore name and player underscore number as provided in the description here. So that's what I did here. And what this allows us to do is we are able to use this method provided by Go. So like so there's a library in Go called like JSON, and that allows us to basically like decode JSON values into Go structs, right? So that's what this pass request body method is doing for us. So I'm basically passing in um, the request body and the model I want to pass the request into. And and in case where I get an error, I simply return an error that failed to pass request body, and that's it. So once we've gotten the request body, of course in the request body we have the player name and the player number, right? The next thing we do is we open the key value store. Now, just to backtrack a little bit, if you go into like the spin.toml file, here I've added this little thing here, and what this thing here allows us to do is it gives us access to the key value store, which Spin provides out of the box. So all I need to do is just say key value stores equals default. And what this will do is create a default key value store for us. So the name of the key value store here is called default. And in my application, because I'll specify this in my Spin app, what I can now do is I can just use this method from the Spin SDK called KV. So by saying kv.openStore, I'm simply opening the key value store which I created, which I had set up here. So that's what I'm doing. I'm opening the key value store, and I'm closing it at the end of the, like, when the method is about to be done to return whatever results it wants to return. And next thing here, I'm checking if the player is already registered. So after opening the store comes with like a couple of methods that I can use. So one of them is get, and what this does is it allows me to get the value. So what I'm doing is I'm using the player number as the key for the player record. And the reason why I'm using the player number is because we know that the player number is going to unique. Like, according to the specifications provided in the question, it says okay, I don't think this was stated. Oh yeah, it says when there is a request to add a player with an already existing number, return a 409 response. So this means like you only have one player with with one number. Like two players can't have the same number basically. So that's why I'm using the player number as the key here. And in a case where the player already exists, I simply return an error and say player already registered. And of course that's the 409 response that was added as one of the notes here. So when the player is already registered, I simply return a 409 status conflict response. Otherwise, if the player is not yet registered, I also have this model called player. So this model called player is just represents each player. So you have the player name, the player number, and the total number of calories taken. So all I just do is I create this model because I'm registering a new player. I create a new player model. I specify the player name as whatever was specified in the request. Same thing for the player number. And for the calories, I simply just specify the calories to be 0 because we're just registering the player, so they don't have any record yet. After doing that, so using the key value store, you have to store your data in bytes, right? So the data has to be stored in bytes. So what I do here is I'm using this JSON library once again to to match out the data. So what this will do is it will give me like the bytes representation of the value, and then I'm storing that in this variable called player JSON. And this is what I'm now setting in the key value store. So I'm saying store.set. So this is one of the methods provided by the store, provided by this key value store, by the Spin key value store. So it's called set. And what I'm doing here is specifying the key to be the player number, and then the value is the bytes representation of the player, which I converted here. And these are just Go error handlings. In a case where there's an error, I simply return an internal server error. Yeah, and same thing for this one. In case we get an error from the store.set method, I simply return a status internal server error. And that's it. Once we've passed the body of our request, we've checked if the player already exists. If not, we simply add the player to the key value store. And once that is done, we can simply return our response now. And for the response, so the status code has to be 201 as specified in the specifications. And then the body of the request has to be the player information. So that's the player name and the player number. So that's added. And then we also have to set the content type to be application/JSON since we are returning a JSON data. And yeah, that's pretty much it for the undo register method. So the next method we have here is undo record. So undo record, so again, we are following like the specifications that were like provided here. So the first thing we know is we are getting two fields in the request body. So that's the player number and the calories. So this record endpoint is for the players to update their calories record, right? So when the request comes in, this method gets it, and the first thing we do again is we need to pass the body of the request. And for that, I've created this model called record request. So this is the player number and the calories, and you can see the JSON representation is player underscore number, and this is just calories. So when we get the request, we try to parse the body of the request, and in case we get an error, we simply return an error, like the error we simply return a failed to pass request body error. And once that is done, again, we open the key value store that we created, from the, like by specifying this config. And once we open that, we check, so if we first validate the input, like how do we validate the input? So the first thing is we know if you're providing a player number, if the player does not exist, then it's an invalid input. Like you need to provide a player number that actually exists in the key value store. And that's what we are validating here. So we try to get the player record from the key value store. If the player is not found, that is, if the player JSON is new, we return an error, like a 404 error, as specified in the description of the challenge. So it says, if there is no player with provided number, return a 404 response, which is what we are doing here. And if the player does exist, so the next thing we check is we check if the calories that was provided in the request is less than 0. So if it is less than 0, of course, that's an invalid input. We can't have negative number of calories. So we simply return an error that's invalid calories. And the status code for that, like the HTTP code for that, is the status bad request, which is equivalent to like the 400 response. And just like we specified here in the notes, when there is an invalid input, return a 400 response, which is what we are doing here once again. Then the next thing is to update the player. So we have to update the player in the database, right? So what we try to do is we say var player models player. So what we're trying to do here is we're trying to convert the request, like we're trying to get the, so we already got the player, like the player JSON, right? But we need to convert that into like the actual model, like the player model. And that's what we are doing here by trying to unmatch out the JSON into this player struct. So once we've done that, in case we get an error, we return an error back to the we return an error like a internal server error. And in a case where that is successful, we simply update the calories to so we increment it by whatever it is that was provided in the request. So we say players with calories equals so basically just incrementing the player calories by whatever was provided in the request. And once that is done, we again, so because we have to store the byte representation of the player in our key value store, we use this match out method again to convert this this player model into the JSON representation. And once that is done, we update our key value store. So we simply say store.set, we provide the player number, and then the new the updated player byte. So that's like after we've made our update, like the newly matched out like player information. And after we've updated that, again, in case we run into an error, we simply return internal server error. If not, that means we've completed all the processes. Like we've parsed the request body, we open our key value store, we validated our inputs. After that, we updated like the player information, and last but not least, we update the player in the key value store. And once that is done, we can simply return our response. And the response here, we have to say status okay, again as specified in the specifications. And also we need to write the player information, which is like the player name and calories. And we also need to set the header to JSON, since we are returning a JSON response. And with that, we are pretty much done with everything we need to do. And yeah, that's the walkthrough of the solution. In case you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments. And yeah, thank you so much for watching.